Much for that welcome. Just want to check that all my PowerPoint slides can be seen on here. Will they be? Yeah, okay, lovely. Okay, so thank you, as I said already, for that very warm welcome. To begin with, I want to just ask you this question here. How can you consciously lead out of who you are? And I want you to consider, why does this matter? This question was never asked of me when I first became a head teacher. And I wish that it had been. Because if it had been asked of me, my whole experience of school leadership would have been very, very different. So as I share with you my reflections this morning, I invite you to think on this question. And as I share with you this morning, I'm going to do it in three key parts. To begin with, I'm going to share with you aspects of my own story. Now, I know there are some in the audience today who have heard my story before. And for those of you who have heard my story before, I'm just going to invite you to listen to it again with new ears and perhaps take something different from what you took initially when you first heard me share my story with you. For those of you who have yet to hear my story, I'm going to ask you to think about your own stories. And the reason I say that is because I've come to realize I couldn't stand here in front of you today without my story. My story gives meaning to the work that I do. And I believe that every single person sitting here in this room, you have a story that is unique and is your own story, and that gives meaning and context to the work that you do. I then am going to share with you lessons that I have learned from school leaders around what it means to be resilient, around what is necessary in order to sustain yourselves in the profession. And then finally, I'm going to share with you some key findings from recent research around coaching, and specifically what it is about coaching that enables school leaders to stay connected to who they are and their very reasons for being in the profession. So we'll begin now with my story. Now, my story begins when my parents first came over here, well, not here, sorry, to England from the Caribbean in the 1950s. And they were part of the Windrush generation, believing that in coming to England, they would be able to find and to develop a better future for themselves. But sadly, it wasn't to be. By the time I came along, my mother had had a nervous breakdown. She had a breakdown shortly before I was born, and then round about the time that I was 2, she had another nervous breakdown. And by the time I was 16, already the experiences of my mother and the experiences of it being a young black girl growing up in South London had formed the Viv Grant that was going to step out into the world. But I didn't know that. I didn't have that level of self-awareness to understand that my history, my parents' history, my early schooling was going to shape how I would show up, until I began my journey into senior leadership. I became a deputy head teacher in my late 20s. It wasn't a role that I expected. It wasn't a role that I had intended to take on. What had happened was I joined my school, and Irene, the head teacher at the time, had said, Viv, can you come and work with me at St Andrews? And I loved Irene. I had huge respect for her. And I said, Irene, yes, of course I will. Of course I'll come and work at your school. And I got there, and I realized why Irene had been begging me to come and join her. It was awful, and I hated it. There were times when I would cry in the toilets. Such was the low level of expectation for the children in the school, and such was the low level of expectation of someone like me when I joined the school. Children thought I had to be the cleaner. No one thought that I could be a teacher because of the way in which their parents, the majority of whom were from a similar background to myself, the way in which the staff there treated their parents with very little respect, was also the way in which I was treated. So I never, ever imagined, let alone one day I'd become deputy, but also one day that I would become head teacher. But as it happened, I moved up and I became deputy. And shortly after I was appointed as deputy, Ofsted was introduced. And no one knew what to expect. It was the first time in England that Ofsted had been introduced. And in all honesty, we weren't very well prepared for it. And what happened was Ofsted came and they said, we're going to put your school into special measures. And Irene, the head teacher, said to me, Viv, I'm going to go. And I cried. Oops, sorry. I cried. And I said, Irene, you can't go. We were going to lead this school together. I know how much this community means to you. I can see what you have been doing. Irene, don't go. Please stay. Let's do this work together. But it wasn't to be. And Irene didn't stay. And so we had a year of acting head teachers. And then finally, after a year, the governors came and they said to me, Viv, we'd like you to consider being head teacher. And again, I was like, no, there's absolutely no way. One, I am the youngest member of staff. Two, I'm pregnant with my first child. There's absolutely no way I'm going to take on this headship. However, at the same time, a number of other things happened. I'd grown to love that school, and I'd grown to love the community. And so I had strong relationships now with parents and the pupils. They trusted me. And one particular child, David Masisi, came up to me, may have been the same day, may have been some time after, but it was round about that period. And David came to me and he said to me, Miss Grant, are we failures? I was like, David, what do you mean? He said, well, Miss Grant, this label, special measures. Now, if any of you have been placed in a school that has a category other than good or outstanding, you will know the impact that label has on the self-esteem of that community, and in particular of teachers and of the young people in the school. And so when David said that to me, again, something resonated. Because at school, I had been told I was a failure. At school, I had been told I would never amount to much. So when our careers teacher had asked children in my class, what do you want to be when we were about 15 and 16? And Jeffrey has said he wants to be an economist. Yeah, that was great, Jeffrey. Yes, you can do that. When Giles has said that he wanted to be a doctor, yes, that's fine, you can do that. And when I said that I wanted to be a nursery nurse, I was told that was too high an aspiration and I should consider something else. In fact, it wasn't something else. I was told that I should consider being a cashier in the local supermarket. And all of these seeds were drip-fed into my mind. And so at 16, as I shared with you that image earlier, I really had this what I would now call a false notion of self, which I carried with me as the adult Viv, as that deputy head teacher, but no one knew because I was so good at hiding it. But when David said that to me, something resonated and it took me back to my school days. But now here, I had someone looking at me, not as a failure, but almost saying, Miss Grant, can you change the futures of us here at St Andrews? Miss Grant, we're being told we're failures. Is that true? And so I thought about what David said. I spoke to family, I spoke to friends, and everyone said, Viv, if it's meant to be, it will be. Just go for it and see. So literally, when I was 8.5 months pregnant, I was interviewed for the headship of my primary school. And the governor said, yes, Viv, we want you. We want you to take up this headship. And so I did what at the time, the only thing I knew to do was to throw myself into the role. And I loved it, I have to be honest, because I loved that school and I had a passion now. And I had a vision for what was going to happen for the children and the community. However, I wasn't as aware as I am now. And there was a particular narrative that was driving my behaviours. And I wasn't made aware of that particular narrative until one evening. That evening, I decided to do a home visit. And I'd been used to driving myself as a school leader in a very particular way. So, and I'm sure most of you who are school leaders here will understand this, or this will resonate. Get up really early, do what I need to do, get into school before everyone else. So I've got that period of quiet so I can attend to all the really difficult and challenging tasks. Manage myself throughout the day, barely giving myself a chance to breathe, but showing everyone that I can do it all. Staying really late until the evenings. In my heart, just thinking, well, it's okay that Isaac, who's my eldest child, I have 3 now, but Isaac at the time was just my only child and my youngest, that he was in the safe care of either my mum or my mother-in-law. And so this particular evening, I decided that there was a child in our school called Alan, and you'll hear me say this a lot. I do. I love the children that our school cared for. And I loved Alan no different than I loved David and all the other children in our school. But Alan had particular issues, he had particular challenges. We knew that he was being brought up by his elder sister, who really didn't give Alan the care and attention that he needed. So when Alan would explode and the whole school would feel the reverberations of his anger, we understood why that was. And we also understood what was our duty of care. We also understood what we needed to do to enable Alan to feel safe enough inside that he could engage with school, that he could engage with us as his teachers. And so I decided that I was going to do a home visit to Alan's sister, because it was secondary transfer time. And I knew that if I didn't get her to engage, then it was going to be very difficult for Alan to go to a school that could really continue the work that we had started. And so I spoke to a member of staff. The family were from the French Caribbean. And I said, Shola, could you please come and do this home visit with me? I need someone there who can translate when I speak to Alan's guardian. And so we went across to the flats. If you imagine, my school was sort of like, if you imagine just here where I'm standing, and the flats surrounded our school. So most of our community came from the flats, and our school was bang in the middle of this estate. And so it's a November evening, we went to the estate, and we knocked on the door, and within about 5 minutes of Alan's sister letting us into the building, she started to swear and she started to shout at me. And in her mixture of broken French and broken English, started to chastise me and to say, who was I, out of all people, to tell her how to bring up Alan, when the whole school knew the times when Miss Grant got in, the early mornings, and the times when Miss Grant left. Who was I to tell her how to raise Alan? And if it had been any other moment in time, I would have been able to have responded to her. But Shola saw the look on my face, and she made our excuses. And then we got to my car, and I cried tears like I have never, ever cried before. I really didn't know where those tears were coming from, because such had been my upbringing, as for reasons I'll share with you as we continue with this story. Acknowledging my emotions, acknowledging how I felt was something that I wasn't used to. So I picked Isaac up from my mum. My mum is amazing. She's 94 now, and she's a very different woman from when we were growing up. But when we were growing up, and around this time as well in my career, my mum's narrative was still very much, you have to be strong to survive in this world. And so I knew I couldn't share with her the depth of emotion that I was feeling at that time. Equally, I knew how proud she was of me. Here was I, her youngest daughter, who when I came along, it seems as if her world was about to end. But here I was now, her youngest daughter, serving the community in which she'd first arrived when she first came to this country. I couldn't tell my mum. So I picked up Isaac, went home, put him to bed, and again didn't share with my husband either, because this sense of tuning into my emotions, feeling confident talking about what I was feeling, allowing myself to be vulnerable, it wasn't Viv Grant. And so the next day I went into school and I found myself at a crossroads, not really knowing who to talk to, who I could share with what I was feeling. I thought, I can't talk to my chair of governors. They've just appointed me. What are they going to think? I can't talk to my school improvement advisor. She's here and she's just going to judge me. What can I do? And so the only thing I thought was, I'm going to talk to Jill. I'm going to talk to Jill, and she was our school counsellor for our most vulnerable children. And in talking to Jill, I began to find a way back to myself. What Jill helped me to realise, as we have in this quote here that hopefully will come up, is that extroversion sometimes develops as a way to cope with self-doubt. And that's what I would do. I'd be extrovert. I'd be happy, I'd be confident to many. But actually, I was avoiding what was going on inside. I was avoiding asking the questions that were from my depths that needed to be answered. And also in talking to Jill, what she helped me to realise were elements of what we now understand as the sacrifice syndrome. I wasn't aware of it before. I wasn't aware of this whole aspect, that when we sacrifice too much of ourselves for too long, we get trapped in ways of being that are detrimental and that are harmful to ourselves. Dissonance becomes the default. And if that is how we are running our lives, how can we be conscious leaders? How can we be the leaders that we need to be? To not only lead our communities, but to lead ourselves as well. And there's a simple model here, which I hope again will come up on the screen, of the sacrifice syndrome. Just take a few moments just to look at that and place yourself in the middle of that diagram. Because I doubt there isn't a single person here in this room, particularly with the levels at which you are working, who hasn't found themselves at some point in time where all their energy has been outward facing, meeting the needs of other people whilst neglecting your own. And that's where I had found myself on that particular evening. And what Jill helped me to understand was my own inner narrative. Myself, every single person here in this room, we have an inner narrative that very often, the phrase I would use is out of awareness, that drives how we behave, that drives how we show up. There'll be very good aspects of that inner narrative, but equally, particularly when we are under pressure, there'll be parts of our inner narrative that will drive our behaviors in ways that do not allow us to show up as our best self. My inner narrative, because of the experiences of my mother and growing up, were all to do with be strong. You carry the world on your shoulders because you only have yourself to rely on. You don't share your emotions because emotions mean that you are vulnerable. And don't you ever, ever ask for help. Because if you ask for help, the world will let you down. And I had to learn that lesson that night in my car, that wasn't necessarily the case. And in the work that I now do with school leaders, I understand so much more now as to why I had to learn that lesson. Because now I work with school leaders who sometimes share a similar driver to myself, the be strong, but there are equally other drivers out there. There's the please other, the be perfect, the try hard. And as I've said, they all have their virtues. But if we live our lives out of awareness, those virtues we don't always harness. And so with the help of Jill, she helped me to realize some new lessons about what it means to be resilient, what it means to be hopeful in the face of adversity, and actually what it means to be authentic. There's a lot when we talk about leadership, about showing up as your true selves, being strong, being confident, being the kind of leader who others will follow. But my lesson has taught me that requires authenticity, and it also requires a certain relationship with vulnerability. If any of you are familiar with the work of Brené Brown, you will know that she says that you can't get to courage without walking through vulnerability. I think if I'd come across that quote when I first started Headship, I wouldn't have understood it. But I understand it now. We have to face up to our fears. We have to face up to those parts of ourselves that some might call our shadow, and they have to be integrated so that we can be authentic. It takes too much energy to pretend to be something that we are not, and we have to find ways that are authentic and true to enable us to be the best that we can be, so that we can be of best service, as I've already said, for ourselves and others. And so I want to take you now to, well then, Viv, okay, this was my lesson. But what are the lessons I've learned from the lives of school leaders? I now feel very fortunate that I spend the majority of my time working one-to-one with school leaders. For me, it's one of the best things that I could do. I really missed Headship to begin with, and all of you who work in schools, you know that joy, you know it, that you get from working with young people, and the joy that you see when they achieve and you take them to a place they've never been before. And I have to say, I now get that same joy when I'm with school leaders one-to-one, helping them to live a more authentic life. So what are some of the key lessons then that I have learned from school leaders? And one of the first lessons that I have learned is that actually if we see ourselves in terms of an iceberg, it's not the top of the iceberg that determines levels of effectiveness. And sometimes we get ourselves caught up and we wonder why we don't make any progress, and it's because too much energy is focused on the top of the iceberg. We have to go to the depths. We have to look what lies beneath the surface. Just as in my case, it was looking beneath the surface that enabled me to sustain myself as a school leader. Your values, your emotions, your stories, they are all, at one degree or another, are determining how you show up and how you engage with your role. In the 1960s, the psychologist Erving Goffman came up with the theory of the leader's front and backstage. And I find this very useful in terms of helping us to understand how we all need to show up and what's happening on a psychological level. So he had the metaphor of the theatre. And if you think about it, it's what I'm doing here today. In terms of I'm here in front of you and I'm speaking. I am hoping that I'm eliciting a positive response from you. I probably won't know that until the end, until you do your feedback. But equally, it's the same for all of you. When you're in a team meeting, when you're speaking to others, you're gauging your audience. And that takes a great ability to manage what is going on inside. And Goffman refers to that as the backstage. So we have our front and we have our backstage. And for yourselves as leaders, the front stage becomes the place, he says, where we perform for our audience, often more than one audience at a time. The front stage becomes our place for conviction and confidence. But as I've already said, it takes energy. And if you just look at this list here that again is going to show, think about it when you do your day-to-day work. Look at this list and consider consciously now, I am being asked to show up authentically. Is it any wonder at the end of a day or a week I feel exhausted? Because I am being asked psychologically and emotionally to have the dexterity and the flexibility to demonstrate key reflection and thinking skills, emotional resilience, confidence, problem solving. And very often, I'm not given any space or time in between meetings or interactions with other people to really come back and center myself. So is it any wonder that sometimes we feel out of sorts with ourselves? And so what we need to acknowledge is that lots of things happen backstage. Backstage, things happen that can't appear on the front stage. A bit like myself in the car that night. Goffman says the leader's idealized life is front stage. The less than ideal is backstage. And it's where we put our doubts and our fears. But we must learn to attend to them. And this, for me, is really important, particularly when we talk about leadership, particularly when we talk about you regaining a sense of autonomy and knowing that with the challenges that you face as school leaders, there is another way. Goffman says, freedom comes when we start to allow people to see not only the glossy image, but the mess as well. Now, that isn't the mess here now, but having that time away from the spotlight, away from the glaring eyes of others, where you can unpack your doubts, where you can unpack your vulnerabilities and be seen as who you really are. Because what we need to recognize is, and again this quote here from Fullan, is that change in organizations is about change in people. And I think one of the things that grieves me the most when I work with school leaders is that there's a heavy focus about change and what's happening in your organizations. We don't recognize that actually parallel change is very often happening for the school leader. And so what happens is we ignore this parallel process, and we can no longer afford to do that. What we need to recognize, as I've already shared with you, none of us are superheroes. I had to learn the hard way. I hope none of you have to learn the way in which I did. None of us are superheroes. We all feel hurt. We all feel pain. And we all need time to process the challenges of the work that we do. We also need to recognize that growth is a lifelong pursuit. And whatever challenges that we face, there'll be times when we are really aware that we are consciously incompetent. And it can hurt at those times. And if you're the be strong, at the consciously incompetent stage, you'll forget to ask for help. And you'll try to do it all yourself. If you're a be perfect, you're going to get stuck because you've got to get everything right before you can move to the next stage. And if you're a please other, then you'll worry about other people. But what if your consciousness and your level of self-understanding and awareness was great enough that you could recognize that within yourself? And for me, I'm sure all of you will know this phrase, Anam Cara, that we all need a soul friend. It's what CSL are providing through the coaching. We all need that one, well, it doesn't need to be one individual, but we need someone who says, it's okay. I see you as you are. You don't need to put on any airs and graces. You don't need to hide from me or yourself. Just come out and be seen, and I will help you to find the gold inside of you. I will help you to understand the truth of who you really are so that you can show up as is intended. And so I just want to conclude now with how this relates to coaching. As you heard in the introduction, this is what I do now for a living. I work with school leaders. I'd like to think I am a bit of an Anam Cara for them. I'd like to think that I am someone, along with my colleagues who work with me, who do work very similar to CSL, where we just accompany individuals on their journeys to being the best that they can be. Because what we need to understand is that a school leader's vocational vitality or capacity to be vital, present, and deeply connected is not a fixed, indelible condition. And you all know that. You know what it's like at the end of a summer term or the start of a summer term. You know when your energy is really high, and then you know after a full week or a term when your energy is weighing. We know that, but we need to recognize that in the support that is offered to you. You are whole human beings, and we need to acknowledge all the dimensions of your work and the roles that you do. And so we must attend, I believe, to these 4 things. Deepening self-understanding. You need to know who you are. I so wish that someone had said to me when I took up my headship, if someone had done some work about, well, Viv, who are you? What's the story that you carry with you into leadership? What's the story that you have about yourself? And how will it shape the woman that you show up to be? If someone had asked me that question, I would have been far more self-aware. We need to attend to developing emotional resources. Emotions are a language, and we're very good at enabling young people in our schools to access those emotions. For some reason, we still find it very hard for ourselves as adults to work in that arena, yet it is key. We also need to attend to sustaining a sense of vocation and purpose. It's a belief that I have that if you're in the education profession, it's a calling. It's something that you have been called to do. And then if it's a calling, we need to be really clear about what is the language of the soul. What is the language of a calling that calls you and only you to take up the role that you are in now? And also, we need to find ways to bring congruity to original ideals and current realities. The minister, who's now gone, but also others, have spoken with you this morning about the current realities that you face. And we know they place stresses internally and organisationally. But as I've already said, if you believe you've been called, we have to find ways to have conversations with you where you can align what you believe with current realities. So we've got to get better at asking you key questions. That's what coaches do. Our questions are like light to help you find your unique way through whatever it is that you are facing. So just a couple of questions here. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you them, but maybe just take a quick note of them. Because if we start asking you different questions, questions that really tap into your sense of self, your sense of vocation, I have found that leaders then really just regain their sense of agency. Rather than feeling done to, rather than finding it so difficult to accept challenge, leaders understand that change begins with them. And they can't change what's going on around them until they understand how to change what's going on within them. Recently, and I'm so proud of this, I have to be honest, Leeds Beckett Research did some research around the work that we do with head teachers, around coaching specifically as a way to sustain vitality. And these were some of their key findings in conclusion. That coaching enables leaders to find a safe space to explore the challenges of leadership. It supports personal well-being and growth. It enhances and enables professional practice and sustains the education system. I really wish that what's happening here in Ireland was happening back in England. This sense and understanding of the power of coaching. You are so fortunate to have this offering here through CSL. It's something that we are still fighting for in England. But recognizing the benefits here are so vital to sustaining your resilience and to keeping you hopeful amidst the challenges of school leadership. And for all these reasons here, this is why coaching is so vital. It is a space that allows you to say, I hear you, I accept you, I value you, I respect you, I understand you. Just imagine if you're not in receipt of that kind of space already, the difference it could make to your lives as school leaders to have a regular space that was afforded for you to allow you to be seen in that way. So why should this matter to you? Just a few closing points here. David White, the poet, says, we must have a relationship with our work that is larger than any individual job description we are given. A real work, like a real person, grows and changes and surprises us, asking us constantly for recommitment. So, again, just in closing, some questions for you to take away. How has your work role changed? How and when has it surprised you? How have you responded to the call for constant recommitment? Your answer to questions such as these will help you identify your own route to sustaining yourself in this profession and remaining resilient. I want to end with reminding you here that we are all on a journey. I'm here talking to you today. My journey will never end. Your journey will never end. So it's really important. I invite you to return back to the question that I started with. What difference would it make if you were to lead your life consciously so that you could be authentic, lead with integrity, and be the best that you can be for your schools and the communities that you serve? Thank you.